Now to the budget. All this fevered speculation in Canberra that the budget means Anthony Albanese wants to head to the polls early is nonsense. The Prime Minister plans on going full term. Anthony Albanese and Jim Chalmers' strategy is to bring down inflation with this budget and then call an election, perhaps later this year, but most likely early next year. Albanese even said this publicly today. He says we won't head to the polls this year. He's indicated the election will be held after March 2025 and even as late as August, although that's very unlikely.
Will there be a budget before the next election?
The budget will set a budget for March next year. The election's due in 2025, and we'll set out that timetable later in this year. You can't have a budget and an election at the same time in May, so we'll have to make that adjustment just as has occurred in the past. You can actually hold the election later. You could hold it as late as August, I think, is the advice.
So Albanese making clear that he would prefer to stay in office as Prime Minister as long as possible. In this sense, the budget is as much about politics as it is about the economy, and perhaps even more so. Plenty of sweeteners, plenty of spending, despite the need to keep inflation in check. Now, the Australian's editor-at-large, Paul Kelly, writes about the paradoxes in the budget, and he says it's loaded with danger. In his view, it risks being the wrong response for our economic times. He writes, forget the orthodoxy. Labor now operates under new rules. It is spending money to cut inflation. It runs an expansionary fiscal policy as the central bank frets over interest rates and ditches 2 generations of pro-market liberalism to build a new economy around state intervention and green industry policy. Now, this budget is highly controversial, especially the Future Made in Australia package. That's the $22.7 billion investment in the next 10 years in green energy. This is where the government picks companies to give grants to or to invest in, rather than just leave it to the private sector, leave it to venture capital companies to work out. Even left-leaning journalist Michelle Grattan was worried that this would see taxpayer funds, well, as she put it, go up in smoke.
What these protections will be, what are the off-ramps, why people should have confidence that their money won't just go up in smoke.
The Treasurer today seemed to acknowledge just how controversial the budget was, but he argued he was channeling Hawke and Keating in their reform agenda.
Now, anything this ambitious will invite a range of responses. I'm relaxed about that. Not all of those responses, in my view, are right. The great reformers of the 1980s and 1990s weren't successful because they looked back and reached for the solutions that might have been right for the problems of 40 years prior. They were successful because they looked forward. They were successful because they recognised that the times had changed and the world was changing. They were successful because they were strategic rather than nostalgic.
But critics disagree with the Treasurer and they question what impact the budget will have on interest rates. The Treasurer says the budget will take the pressure off inflation, but economists fear it could make inflation worse. Now, Jim Chalmers' argument is that giving relief to areas like energy bills and rents reduces those components of CPI. But the risk is that the extra money some people have in their pocket could be spent elsewhere and thus contribute to inflation and the need for a rate rise.
I still think the most likely outcome is some rate hikes, but maybe not 3.
The idea that this is somehow going to trick the Reserve Bank into reducing interest rates, come on, it's a con job.
This is inflationary. It's going to drive up inflation and therefore interest rates.
So this is why the decision by Labor to, in effect, spend their way out of an inflation crisis is, as Paul Kelly says, against the orthodoxy. It's high risk. where Albanese was questioned on this in the media today.
You're entirely confident that the combination of the energy bill relief and the increase in Commonwealth rent assistance will drive down inflation by that 0.5 percentage point next year?
Well, that's what Treasury have said.
Do you back them? Because I mean, they get stuff wrong. They got the deficit, which has turned into a surplus, wrong by about $10 billion.
No, what we've done...
If that calculation is wrong from Treasury, and if rates rise, and they could do so, of course, for a variety of reasons, but if the government then is blamed for the rate rise, this will be a massive political issue heading into the next federal election. Now, Albanese currently sits in the Lodge with a slim majority. Labor has 78 seats, the Coalition holds 55, Independents 12, and minor parties 6. The Coalition needs around 19 seats to form majority government. But if an election were held today, it's likely that Labor would lose its majority at the very least. Now, with a 4% swing against Labor, they'd likely lose 11 seats, taking them down to 67 seats. Now, these 11 seats would be gains for the Coalition, bringing their tally up to around 66. This would, of course, mean a hung parliament. But then the Coalition might also win a seat or two back from the Teals, putting them ahead of Labor. Now, no question, the Coalition recovering ground is a very tough ask. But Dutton's team believe that this budget makes their task of trying to win government just that little bit easier. Now, coming up on the show tonight, can the Liberals win back the blue ribbon seat of Wentworth from the Teal Allegra spender? Well, their new candidate, Ro Knox, will be joining me for her first exclusive interview later this show. A Labor politician also has today called for Israel's annihilation by repeating a hate chant that even Anthony Albanese said has no place in Australia. So will he find the courage as Prime Minister to call out his own politician? Plus, Julie Bishop criticised for wearing an expensive dress to a fashion week instead of shutting down anti-Semitism at ANU, where she's the Chancellor.